Many people like to claim that the United States was once a Christian nation, or even that Western values align with Christianity. These claims paint the United States and the West as if they are a beacon of morality in the world. But it doesn't take much looking to find that this nation, its actions both in the past and the present, are anything but in alignment with Christ. So let's walk through the historical and even conspiratorial to prove that associating the United States with God is actually a blasphemous thing to do, because the Christian nation narrative, it's a manufactured lie. If America was ever truly a Christian nation, you would expect to see that in its founding documents, right? But as I'm sure we are all aware of, the original Constitution never mentioned God, never mentioned Jesus, and it never mentioned Christianity. It was only 4 years after the original Constitution that the Establishment Clause and the Free Exercise Clause were added to the Constitution, and they weren't there to protect or defend Christianity. And then there's the Treaty of Tripoli. I have no idea if I'm saying that right. Tripoli, whatever. But this treaty makes things a little more awkward, because in 1797, 10 years after the Constitution was created, President John Adams signed this treaty, and it was ratified by the Senate, ratified unanimously. And here's what it says word for word. The government of the United States of America is not, in any sense, founded on the Christian religion. But then comes the question, did it become a Christian nation somewhere else down the line? Well, let's examine the fruit of this supposed Christian nation. We all know about the first wave of Europeans who arrived here and committed a mass genocide against the Native Americans. Some of the things they did to murder these innocent people was just disgusting. They went so far in some instances to infect blankets with diseases and then to give them to the natives. Just a creative and godly way to kill them off. And how did this supposed Christian nation at that point justify all of this? Manifest destiny, of course. Duh. They claimed that God gave them a right to this land. Doesn't that sound familiar, or am I just mistaking it with something else? Then for nearly 250 years, Americans treated African slaves as property, tortured and murdered hundreds of thousands, if not millions, of African people. And who, might I ask, were the main defenders of slavery? People who claimed to be Christian. They claimed that chattel slavery was God ordained. And then the Jim Crow era happened, where churches were segregated and lynchings happened practically everywhere. A Christian nation? Okay. But many people hate talking about the past, and they want us to focus on the present. Because hey, things can change, right? But post Jim Crow to today, it doesn't really get any better. For instance, there's the MK Ultra program. You hear that and it's like, ew, conspiracy. But it's actually confirmed. It's a fact. This was a real thing. For 20 years, they conducted illegal mind control experiments using drugs, psychological torture, and they did this to US citizens and Canadian citizens. And by no surprise, multiple of these participants ended up becoming mass murderers, serial killers, and the like. And then there were dozens of radiation experiments that were conducted on non-consenting US citizens, some of whom were cancer patients. They exposed them to heavy doses of radiation, and it was all to just observe the outcomes. And it was all funded by the Pentagon. And people like to call the idea of what many call chemtrails to be a conspiracy. But it's a fact that from the 1940s to the 1960s, the US military conducted hundreds of experiments. These were open-air tests on populations of people in densely populated areas, and they sprayed bacterial tracers over these populations, as well as other toxic stimulants, just so that they could see how these biological agents spread in a population. And of course, there were hundreds, if not thousands, of experiments that were conducted on non-consenting people who were mentally disabled, mentally ill, prisoners, and the like. And it was done to them without their consent and even against their will. In addition to this, America has invaded, bombed, and overthrown governments in over 80 countries since World War II. And the result every single time? Nations full of uninvolved civilians who are left to be plunged into chaos and unthinkable suffering. Our government is so big on not letting other countries meddle in our politics, but yet we seem to have our hands in so many other people's politics. Hypocrisy much? From being the only nation to ever drop an atomic bomb, to even one of our most recent wars, which was based on lies of weapons of mass destruction that resulted in 500,000 to 1 million civilian Iraqis being murdered by our troops. And how did Christian America respond to this? Well, by wrapping their crosses at their churches with American flags and embracing all the more the conflation of patriotism with Christianity. So here's the ultimate point. This Christian nation myth was a lie that was manufactured in the 1950s, once again, during the Cold War, similar to Judeo-Christian values. For instance, in 1954, "Under God" was added to the Pledge of Allegiance. President Eisenhower signed it into law because he went to church and sat in a sermon, and he was convinced from the pastor that adding these words into our Pledge of Allegiance would put us at opposition to communism. So it wasn't added because it was historically accurate, nor was it biblically accurate, but because it was good propaganda. And then 2 years later, in 1956, "In God We Trust" became the official national motto for the very same reason. So it's very clear that America was not built on Christian principles, and even if it was, it really hasn't been behaving like it much in the world. Sure, we do some good things here and there. I won't pretend that it's 100% negative. But if you knew someone who was, say, a serial killer, you found out later on they're a serial killer, but you knew them and you saw that they would feed the poor and do things for people in need in your neighborhood, but then it came out that they had been killing people every week as long as you had known them, would you look back on them and say, wow, they were a pretty good guy though. He really still embodied Christ-likeness. He really still embodied Christian principles. You know, he might have taken multiple lives every week for as long as I knew him, but man, did that guy feed the poor. Yeah. Probably not. As they say, you can put a lipstick on a pig, but still a pig. It's why I say to equate American values or even Western values, because we didn't get to all the other Western countries and what they've done. But to equate that with Christianity, it's just blasphemous, because it's essentially to say that what they do, how they're existing in the world, is an accurate representation of Jesus, of God. Weird. Exporting evil, exploiting people for resources and information, causing the destruction of entire societies, all for your political gain and control, starting many wars of choice and often lying to the public in order to get their support to get in it, perverting justice for the wealthy, people in government and law enforcement who just seem to be above the law, as well as enabling and sustaining oppression practically almost everywhere. It's very clear that the US may invoke God's name. It may claim to be morally superior, but its actions since its founding prove that it was never a Christian nation, that it never represented biblical principles, and by the Bible's standards, it can never be a Christian nation. And it never should be, because nations are not Christian. People are. And I want to be clear that me saying this, I'm talking about the American government. I'm talking about the people in power here who have the ability to choose how this country engages in the world. Us average citizens, we don't have the power over that, and many of us, even those who are not Christian, don't support the kind of things our government has been guilty of. The people who have the power, who have been given the power, have chosen to do it in the way they have. And it's that is associated to American ideals and American values and Western values. It's the actions of our government. But you are welcome to let me know what you think in the comments. I know I have very strong opinions because I know what I know, and I can't unknow or unsee what I've seen. But you're welcome to tell me what you think, and you're welcome to share this with anyone you think might enjoy it too. Thank you so much for being here, and I will see you next time.